Welcome. Today we'll explore cyber insurance and risk. For more information about today's program, make sure to check out Demetrias's blog on the topic and other useful links located at the end of the presentation. So with me today is Demetrias Rodgers, Planet's CTO, and he has over 22 years of IT experience, including 16 years supporting state and local government. Prior to joining Planet, Demetrias served as the Deputy Chief Operating Officer at Virginia Information Technologies Agencies, or as we call it, VITA. In his role at Planet, Demetrias ensures solutions and services are aligned to meet the needs of our commercial and state and local government customers by partnering with them and their executive leadership team on strategy creation, adoption, implementation, and execution specific to the technology services and solutions. Demetrias is also a great friend and colleague. And welcome, Demetrias. We are so glad that you're joining us on the program today.
Thank you, Ken. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Thank you, Demetrias. So excited to have you on the show today. We've got a bunch of poll questions. We're just going to go ahead and launch them all at once in the beginning, and then we'll get back to them at the very end during the question and answer period. But first off, we always like to hear about who's joining us today. So if you could kindly, just select the, what organization you're coming from, we'd appreciate that. Next, we have some very topical survey questions, and these are all anonymous, by the way. So feel free to answer them, and don't get bogged down and worry about who it's coming from. No one's going to see your answers. So just we're just trying to get some polls here. So are you training your employees on security awareness? We'd love to hear about this. This is definitely one of the questions they're going to ask you on a cyber insurance application. Have you or anybody you know been able to obtain cyber insurance? Not been able to get cyber insurance? We're kind of curious about that answer there, as well as what kind of increases have you seen? We know what the industry is telling us, but we'd love to see what you're seeing out there in the field. So please go ahead and answer that one for us. All right, with all that said, before we get started, let's quickly go over the agenda. Cyber insurance, trends, risks, impacts, and mitigations you should be aware of is the topic for today. We're going to talk about trends in coverage, what we're seeing, who's most at risk, what should I have in place for cyber insurance coverage, what can you do to stay ahead of the game? Because this stuff is changing very quickly. And then finally, questions. We really want to hear about your experiences. We wanted to hear about what lessons you've learned, what things you're seeing out there in the field. So please save your questions for the end and share some of your experiences as well. Obviously, we don't want to hear about specific companies that you're, cyber insurance companies, but would like to hear about your experiences. So Demetrias, talk to us a little bit about the current landscape of cyber insurance industry and what we're kind of seeing here.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you, Ken, for the introduction. So yep. What's common across, all industry sectors is cyber insurance is going up, right? The question now is how much and can you get it, right? We've been seeing significant increases in cyber attacks across the board, ranging from phishing, denial of service, and ransomware. Ransomware probably being one of the largest. Here we have some examples that we talked to. Where we've seen some large hacks coming in using various methods, right? So the Grand Theft Auto, Uber was breached. I feel like every day you're seeing different targets, whether they're coming from nation state actors like you see from the Ukrainian organizations in terms of that, as well as, just even kids' gaming systems being hacked. And so, that trend is going up. What we've seen is that has absolutely increased significantly since the start of COVID, because what we have noticed is across all sectors is that as companies started to adopt the user from anywhere access into their environment, it actually exposed some holes in their cyber posture, and of course the bad actors took advantage of that. And so one of the things we see is the phishing remains the attack vector of choice. Users are today and have always been one of our biggest risk factors. And email phishing is still one of the most successful for hackers. As you can see here, we talk about the top cybersecurity fears. Phishing is the entry point that we talked about, but then number 2 is ransomware, right? Number 3 is misconfiguration, specifically in the cloud environments. 4 is bad password management, simple passwords, things like that. And then 5 is lack of patching.
Yeah, absolutely. That lack of patching, though, how fast are you getting your critical patches done? Are you doing it within 30 days? I mean, you're a sitting duck if it hasn't gotten done in that amount of time, right? It's just a matter of time. So yeah,
Sure.
excellent.
Absolutely. And on that patching,
Yeah.
I don't I don't know, and I won't ask what you guys are doing in terms of that, but you should have classifications in your policy that where you call out in terms of how quickly you're patching critical, how quickly you're patching highs, how quickly you're doing mediums, lows, etc. And as you can see, cyber insurance is the dumpster fire, right? Um, especially for the users, the people who we have to get it. It's no longer an option. So what you're seeing is premium increases. They've introduced pre-qualifications more so than before, significantly more. And we'll talk about some of that today. Uh, Independent validation. A lot of insurance companies are bringing in third parties. You're seeing policies just get canceled all the way, or being simply denied for future coverage, and then split coverage, meaning we'll take on some, but you're going to carry risk on your own, or we'll only take about 50% of what you're seeking here in terms of being able to get covered, or maybe half of your environment, depending on what it is. We've seen scenarios, and that trend is continuing across the board for a number of companies. So let's talk a little bit about why we're seeing some of this craziness that we're seeing in this industry, right? As you can see, the median ransomware payments are increasing significantly year over year. In 2018, we were minimal. Q3 2018, as of 3 years later, and or 4 years later in 22, it spiked. Obviously, you look at the COVID timeframe where it spiked above average ransom payment of 300,000 plus. It's dropped a little bit, but it's still above 200,000. It's still trending back up. Um, the cyber insurance demand is also increased. And I read an article the other day where a couple years ago you could get a $3 million policy for around $3,000. That same policy today is about $300,000 for that
That's
same level of
insane.
coverage.
That's insane.
So if that's any indication of significant change in this environment in terms of cost, if you have budgets, those budgets were blown. I know a lot of specifically state and local government, it's a biannual budget. So you'd say, okay, I'm going to project to start for 2 years, and that was simply blown up. If you wanted to maintain coverage, the 85% of insurance brokers, they show that it's up. As you can see, Gov, uh, industry, services, pharma, financial, in terms of the amount, the cost data breaches. The financial sector is the cost because we all know, and when there's a impact on the financial sector, it's counted in millions of dollars per second. But it's still significant in the spend, the cost of a data breach in the government sector. I want you to remember this slide because I'm going to reference something in the later slide that we're gonna find quite interesting, I think. So we already talked about the premiums have gone up, but what should not be surprising for most people is that it's going to continue to increase. There was a survey of global insurers that published last summer, and 82% of insurers expect increases over the next 2 years. There is a way to address that, and we're going to talk about that to try to maintain some control of that spend, um, mitigate your impacts, and also mitigate the possibility of you not being able to acquire insurance. Um, lack of understanding is the number three reason for price increases, right? A lot of insurance firms don't understand or had a lack of understanding of what the potential payouts would be for these. Attacks are getting more sophisticated is the number one reason. The cost of ransomware attacks is the number two reason. But as I stated when I started the sentence, is the lack of accurate understanding of cyber posture at the insured frames of those people, of the clients, was a major factor in terms of why these prices are going up. So they were just saying, look, I don't know how good your posture is, so we're going to increase your premiums by 75%. There are some steps that they've taken to address that, and we'll talk about that in another slide. So one of the things that I mentioned earlier is not only have they raised the bar for entry for cyber insurance in terms of the amount of money it costs to obtain a decent policy, they're also increasing the requirements for organizations to even qualify to obtain insurance. One of the things that more and more carriers are doing is they are engaging third parties and using third party scanning technology to help understand your security environment. As I mentioned, one of the reasons for the increases before was a lack of understanding of your security posture of your environment. So what they start to do to address that going forward, but also this could be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on what you believe they would find in your organization, is to bring a third party in, do what they call inside out underwriting by looking for the vulnerabilities and weaknesses within your environment and creating a policy that reflects their level of risk. The third bullet here talks about they've increased the standard requirements for coverage. A few years ago, most insurers said, hey, you need to have multiple MFA, which is multi-factor authentication. If you have remote access, this is something that you have to have. However, this is, just one of the minimum requirements now. Even for small organizations, most cyber insurance providers are requiring that you show proof that you have antivirus, you have firewalls, you have MFA, you have backup, and you have encryption in place. And that means encryption at rest, encryption in transit, etc. And with your backup, it's not just that you're doing a backup, how resilient is your backup strategy? Are things that you're looking for. So one of the questions that we get here at Planet and a lot of our account teams and others are asking, hey, what do you guys understand, or can you tell us what some of the cyber insurance providers are looking for? What should we be prepared to answer and have in place in order to ensure that we get the best possible pricing, or we can minimize our risk, et cetera. And so here's a sample questionnaire, right? And so on the right side of the screen, you see the questions that they'll ask you, and then on the left side, what we've illustrated here are things that would correlate to those questions in terms of what things you should have in place to be able to address these. What I won't ask you is how many of you have all of these checks, but it's going to be key um, that you understand, hey, these are the things that we need to have in place in order to give ourselves the best opportunity to have not only insurance, but the lowest cost premiums that we can get. As you can see, you talk about user ID and password, multi-factor authentication. How are you handling, your remote access? They talk about advanced threat protection. They talk about, what are you using to guard against, your domains, what type of EDR solutions you have in place. If you have an EDR solution in place, do you have a SOC, et cetera? What's your patching strategy? So I'm not going to read through every question because I know everyone on this can read, but I think this is key because it helps get an understanding of, hey, here are the things that I need to take back to my executive leadership in case we are falling short of this, or if I'm planning for this year, my policy is about to run out, to get some semblance of what's going to come my way.
And the key here is failure to answer these questions, or most of these questions, could jeopardize your ability to get cyber insurance. So in the past, MFA is just not a negotiable anymore. It's a mandatory requirement pretty much from what I'm seeing. And there's other mandatory requirements as well to get cyber insurance at this point. It's just getting more and more difficult. And yeah.
You're absolutely right, kid. And with that being said, even the ones that if you fail to answer the question and you are lucky enough to get offered a policy, that policy will be extremely expensive.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when we start talking about what's actually required, here are some things that from the industry perspective we looked into and identify for the team. And as you'll see, some of these things on here are not specifically technical controls. That last slide showed the The technical solution is to address some of the questions you're going to be asked, or you should be prepared to be asked. The first one, did you have competent in positions for IT security leadership? You have a CISO in place, right? Believe it or not all organizations have a CISO, at least a full-time one, right? That CISO may split time between, hey, I'm the CISO and I'm the director of IT and I'm the COO. So, that's becoming less and less acceptable for insurance purposes, because they want to make sure that you have focused resources on IT and securing your environment. I know a lot of you answered. I don't think I saw any no's on the staff training for cyber security awareness. So that's good. That should be done annually, and they're going to look for that at minimum. Strong passwords is obviously key. We touched on the system backups. That you're meeting any regulatory compliance requirements that you may have in your environment, specifically if you're state and local government. If you're in a regulated industry like, financials or something like that. Multi-factor authentication. Number 7 is an example of one of those non-technical controls. You have an incident response plan in place. Are you testing that incident response plan? How often are you testing that incident response plan? These things should be called out in your policies and procedures for your organization. Do you have an endpoint detection and response solution in place? Is it being leveraged? How is it? More and more common, you're seeing a lot of organizations that are leveraging third parties. They're leveraging infrastructure as a service providers like, Microsoft Azure. They're leveraging PaaS services. They're leveraging SaaS services. What are you doing to evaluate those third parties? So third-party risk management is a significant activity because a lot of breaches that actually happen because of third parties. No matter how solid your security policies and places, your policies, technical controls, etc., that you have in place, if the third parties that you allow access to your environment that are integrated into your environment, if theirs is just not as solid, then that's a weak point for you. And then annual pen testing. And so, this data was published September of last year, so in the fall. So it's fairly recent. And then, as you can see, looking at the different data factors here, we talked about having, the cost of having these things in place or not having these things in place.
And on number 9 there, I mean, if you're doing business with somebody, you got in the contractual work, you've got to make sure that they have some cyber insurance, some level of cyber insurance. It's different for every agency or organization, but contractually, you got to make sure that those third parties you're working with meet your cyber insurance requirements, obviously, in your contracts.
And that's a great point there, Ken, because what I always tell people is doing the assessment shows you that they have the ability to meet your security requirements. However, the contract is your shield to ensure that they are actually doing those things, because you can assess someone on their ability to do it or what they're doing. It doesn't mean that they actually are applying it for your environment or what they're managing for you. As well as one of the requirements you should also have is what type of insurance coverage that you have, that they have, and ensure that lines up with your minimum risk. All right. So who's getting hit the hardest? We talked about on a very early on a slide about the cost of breaches, and education was low, right? Because education and government, those were two of the lowest ones in terms of the cost, but they're the most frequently hit. And you ask why. I think we all know the answer to that, because in education, for one, it's an open environment, right? They want to be open for their students. They have students across the country, some universities across the world, depending on what classes they're offering. So it's truly access from anywhere. So there is a concern about being able to close things down lock things down to impact the student experience. I have friends that are senior level security professionals within the education sector, and I talk with them all the time about the challenges they run across in terms of being able to implement, because there are board members who certainly don't understand some of the security requirements, needs, and support them. And so, they're getting hit by ransomware. And I think we've seen some articles lately where more and more classes have been impacted by ransomware events. Government is next. This was close to my heart, coming from government. It's been the amount of time I have in government. And the reason why this is a hard hit sector is because of, depending on its local government, state government, whatever it is, in most government environments, there are legacy applications. There's things that probably need to be modernized, which is why legacy modernization is a high priority amongst most state CIOs. But just making sure you have all the tools in place, you have the processes laid out, you have the personnel to execute. Those are things that are critical in trying to change that direction here. And then you got the technology, manufacturing, and healthcare sectors.
Yeah, and just on the government thing, obviously, Demetrius, you and I share a common history of long-term work in the government sector. And, I think the part that's being hit the most in government are those smaller agencies, right? The ones that, they know their business, but they're not security professionals typically, right? So they do their best, but you know what? They're still under the same mandates to do auditing and to make sure they're working towards a framework from like a NIST framework or something. But it's those smaller agencies that don't have the resources that are real low-hanging fruit that, if you're working towards a framework, then pretty much all these questions that are being asked by the cyber insurance industry, those should all be closed. I mean, those should all be no-brainer answers, right? Because you're answering those audit questions. The problem that I'm seeing in working with government for a long time is that these agencies don't get audited. And I'm not, and it's easy for me to say since I'm not in government anymore, but, they're not getting audited every year, right? So it might be 10 years or 5 years before a small agency is audited by the central agency or something like that. And I think that's the low-hanging fruit that these actors are going after, because they know they don't have the resources, obviously.
You're absolutely correct. You're 100% correct. And this is also one of the sectors where you start seeing where you have these shared positions, right? They don't have dedicated, depending on if it's a county, if it's a city, and how big that is, how well they're funded. They may be the ones that also have the shared personnel, right? Where, the CIO is also the IT director.
Right.
And so having, for states, most states, at least the large ones, have a separate governance and risk department, and make sure that the governance, risk, and compliance organization is separate from the operational teams, right? You need to ensure that the CISO is interacting with the COO, and in Virginia, where I was, I worked very closely with our CISO. I would tell him all the time, you can audit me anytime you want, because we would ensure, from a security operations perspective, that we had all the things in place to protect our environment, to protect our agencies, infrastructure, as well as protecting our citizens.
But it all goes back to having a benchmark. They need to be working towards some kind of framework to measure themselves against. If you don't have a framework, then you don't have a target to shoot for, right?
You're absolutely correct.
Yeah, very good conversation there.
So, along with some of the things that the insurers are providing, there's been new guidance being pushed out. All right, just in November, CISA pushed out new guidance. One of these changes was an update on assessing an infrastructure's assets resiliency. Right, how resilient are you as an organization? If you were to be hit with a cyber event, how well could you recover? Are you able to withstand, and to what extent? Right? What is the impact of the disruption? Could you continue? Would it shut down your business? Specifically, state and local and federal governments, that impacts the citizens. And if this guidance was specifically intended to ensure that these entities, specifically those in state and local government space, federal space as well, begin to take more steps to strengthen cyber posture. Federal space, they usually tend to stay much further ahead, as we said. When you start getting into state and local government entities, that's where you start having you start seeing more and more success by the bad cyber actors.
Yeah.
Implementing these changes, having that resiliency in your environment will almost surely ensure that you are able to get coverage, right? You can maintain that coverage, and then you can try to mitigate the financial implication of the premium increases. One thing that's interesting is you're starting to see, obviously, the federal government, they haven't interacted bans yet, but they are highly discouraging ransomware payments.
Yeah.
And you're starting to see states embrace that. And there's 2 states specifically that I'm aware of, and I know more that are considering it, that have actually placed bans on making ransomware payments. Right? And the reason for this is because they say if you don't make the payments, it's going to drive down the motivation for people to attack you with ransomware, because there's no value in it if they're not getting any money. Since most of the ransomware events, the primary driver is finance. Is a financial one, right? But this measure actually could have significant impact on public entities, our government entities, because as we just talked about, specifically the smaller you are, and depending on where you are from a maturity perspective, the reason why the attacks are so significant that you've seen on the slides, that the reason why you're the most targeted is because state and local government is the least prepared for these types of cyber attacks, right? Including the educational sector. So there's fewer options for risk transfer if you're not paying. And a lot of times what we see is, I need to get back up and running. I'm impacting citizens, I'm impacting students. I'll just pay the ransom, because the cost of not being able to conduct business far exceeds what the ransom request is. And that's what they're counting on, and the bad actors. So, we talked about a lot about, hey, this is why it's happening. I think I scared you sufficiently, but there's some good news, right? There are things that can help you out there address most of the concerns that you have to address from a technical perspective. Now, your processes and things like that, you can work with, people like Planet. We do have a compliance team to ensure that you can do assessments on your environment, give you some guidance, things that you where you should be in terms of security score, et cetera. But there are things that you can do to demonstrate the effectiveness as you're prepared to renew your policy, obtain insurance, or survive or not it, right? To ensure that you have cyber resilience in place. Insurers are looking for these things. And so here's an expanded list of things that are likely to be included that we touched on this earlier in the checklist example. But on this slide, I want to show some things that you probably already own, whether or not they're implemented. But what we've seen is most organizations have access to these things based on their current enterprise agreements. The question is whether or not they are implemented or sufficiently implemented and configured correctly, right? So multi-factor authentication, you can get that with Azure AD P1. Endpoint protection, that's Defender for Endpoint, right? You start talking about privileged identity management, that's available with Azure AD P2. And more insured providers are ensuring that you actually have PIM. I would not be surprised if this becomes a mandatory minimum requirement. It was a mandatory
trust item. Yeah, there's no standing access, just in time access. Those are sitting ducks for people to pick off, right? So that just makes sense. If you have parts of the E5 suite, you can get PIM, privileged identity management, and that goes a long way to reducing that surface vector right there.
Yes, absolutely. From an email security perspective, that's available for Defender with O365. Make sure you're patching your OS and your applications. That goes back to your patch policies. Your staff awareness, that goes into your security awareness training. For any customers involved that we have on our call, Planet has a great platform for training when needed. Make sure you're doing regular backups, testing your business resiliency plan. How often are you doing disaster recovery planning? Are you doing your disaster recovery planning? What type of DR planning are you doing? Are they tabletop exercises? Are they actual true failover events? Depending on what your environment is, depending on if you're on premise, you're hybrid, you're off cloud, those things need to be accounted for. What type of security monitoring platform do you have? Does that platform have proactive management capabilities, automatic breach detection capabilities, auto remediation capabilities? Sentinel is a great example of a tool that can help with those things. And then your processes, right? These are the non-technical controls, your incident response. Do you have system security plans? What's your vulnerability assessment? How often are you doing a vulnerability assessment of your environment? These are all things that will help you if you have these in your toolbox. With cyber insurance coverage, but it's more so than that to me. It's also mitigating the risk to you as an organization, right? So although this conversation has been primarily focused on things you can do to ensure you get a cyber insurance, things that you can ensure your premiums aren't going to skyrocket over the next course of this year, but it's also to increase your security posture as an organization. So if we have any CISOs on the phone, anyone in the security organization, help you be able to sleep at night.
All right, so that concludes the majority of the presentation. We wanted to open up the floor. I've got some questions, but I would love to hear from you all as well. So if you have some questions, please put them in the chat, or if you can unmute, go ahead and unmute. We'd be happy to take your questions. And while we're waiting for that, let's take a couple seconds and look at the survey results. First of all, it seems like the majority of our users, as expected, are from state and local government today on our call, which is typical. But are you training your employees on security awareness? So 91%, that is excellent to hear that folks are training their employees. It's definitely one of those questions on the security, the insurance application form. So that's great to see, 91%. And the only 8% said they didn't know. So, that's an excellent number right there. And we had 12 responses there. Have you or anybody you know not been able to obtain cyber insurance? And the answers were 12% yes. 12% of people know that they know somebody who wasn't able to get insurance, and 50% said no, they didn't know. So then a bunch of not sures there. So interesting there. What level of increase have you seen? Now, this was a really interesting response, and the answers were 20 to 30%, 50 to 30 to 50%, and 50 to 70%, and then greater than 75. And it looked like the majority, we were split, 30%, 23% of people were in the first range of 20 to 30%. And that's what we're seeing industry-wide, about 28% increases in premiums, at least as of last year. Now, I'm sure those are going to go up this year, but 28% was the premium increase that we saw in the industry last year. So assuming that's going to go up, and we're seeing roughly 23% of our users are seeing that kind of increase. We're seeing 23% as well in the 30 to 50% range. So interesting that, yeah, they're depending on where they're in the renewal cycle, probably they're kind of straddling that line. And we're seeing up to 50% of people roughly, or 46% of our people are saying, they're in that 50%, 20 to 50% range, which is interesting. And then greater than 75%, we're seeing another 23% of people. Interesting. 75% increase on their premium. 23% of our folks said they're seeing that large increase on their premium. So again, it sounds like those folks, and it sounds like there's some work to be done on some of these basic block and tackle security capabilities. If you're using Office 365, even M365 E3 has lots of capabilities. If you're not taking advantage of all those, we strongly suggest you get up with your cloud strategist, account team, and let's talk about the things you're not possibly using, or things about where those gaps are and how we can get you to get those gaps fixed from a licensing perspective. Again, we're happy to help you in that endeavor. Let's see if we have any other questions coming in from the user base of our audience today. Doesn't look like it yet. So I've got a couple questions, Demetrius.
Absolutely. And one thing I will say before I take your first question, Ken,
Yeah,
is that what is becoming more and more common is that
yeah,
insurers are putting caveats in your policies
yeah, yeah.
where if you are subject to a nation state attack,
That was
they
my
may
first
not cover
question.
you. Oh,
Absolutely, yeah.
okay.
Which is crazy because like the majority of these are coming from nation states, right? I would think.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
So
that's a
I
huge
would urge
loophole.
you, I would urge you to closely look at or talk to the person who's in charge of doing your policies, and look at any caveats that they may be subjecting you to, because if that is the case, then you may find yourself without coverage and being able to having to account for that entire amount yourself.
Yeah, that's a huge loophole. Just kind of curious if folks, I know some of this is sensitive information, but if there's any undisclosed rationale for an insurance claim denial, we'd love to hear about that. Demetrius, tell us about like XDR solutions like Sentinel and how they can make a difference. Like, why is it so important?
Yeah, and so even though this is not right now a minimum requirement, the reason it's so important is because it shows a level of maturity. It shows you that you are getting alerts, you're actively monitoring your environment, and Sentinel also has capabilities to uh, do automated remediation. Um, and you can detail what that remediation approaches should be.
Yeah,
So, when you have these XDR solutions like Sentinel in place to correspond with things like Defender, you can mitigate the risk or the impact of any breach
yeah,
as quickly as possible. And so, when these security solution providers like Microsoft is one of the leading has become one of the leading security providers now in this industry, which a couple of years ago maybe that wasn't the case, but today they are. If you're leveraging these tools, then it can actually help you significantly in mitigating the cost of any type of breach to your environment. In fact, I would also say that if you haven't heard about this, there are a lot of initiatives where insurers are providing with some of these large cloud providers like Microsoft and others. And if you have certain things in place, like from the E5 stack that Ken touched on, then you will be subject to discounts.
yeah,
And so
yeah.
these
In
are
fact,
things that
we saw
that
that. We saw some of
yeah,
during the research of this. Yeah.
yep,
Yeah, the other thing about Sentinel, I think that's really crucial is that, that Sentinel also helps with alert fatigue, right? So if these common alerts that you get, they're just noise, right? They're just constantly bogging down our security teams, which are limited enough in personnel. They don't have enough people, right? So if you're wasting your time on these low-hanging fruit alerts that should be open and closed and not really have to be investigated, then you're saving your valuable resources for that more intensive investigation work that really what they can do and do a better job at, right? Versus dealing with the day-to-day alert fatigue of these 80% of alerts that should just be open and closed probably. So,
tuning is
I think
important.
Sentinel can go a long way from an automation standpoint, and especially from an assistance in helping you with your limited security, positions that you have.
Absolutely, absolutely. The tuning aspect is significant. It's one of the things that we call out, and as we work with our customers to implement Sentinel, we work with them on initial tuning of it to do exactly that. We want to make sure we pay attention to things that need to be paid attention to, as opposed to being distracted by white noise.
Awesome. It looks like we've just been joined, and I'm glad that Dr. Lanham is here. He's our Director of Security and Compliance. He's just joined us. And I'd love to bring Michael into this conversation as well. So, like, Michael, you've been listening for a little bit, all right? And so one of the questions I have is, Mike, with IT shops reacting to unexpected events virtually almost every day, why bother with tabletop exercises? What are your thoughts about that?
That's a great question, and I think the answer is really twofold. Making a tabletop exercise look and smell like a day-to-day reaction of some element of your data center is offline, or one of your two primary links are offline and is cutting back throughput for the rest of the organization, that is a waste of time for your tabletop. Don't make your tabletop scenarios, either in contingency land or incident land, look like a standard day-to-day action reaction. Make it look like something different that you haven't typically rehearsed, and make it an event or a scenario that is going to be sufficient to provoke adaptation. So it needs to be sufficiently large scale or sufficiently long in duration that requires a adaptation that you just don't normally do. As an example, before COVID-19, the very idea that many companies would do days on end of remote work was not something that many companies had contemplated, or if they had contemplated, the answer was typically not just no, but heck no. So the scenarios need to be driven by something other than what you see on a day-to-day basis. But it is a very frequent question. I adapt every day. I don't need practice adapting. We adapt every day to small outages, sometimes temporary, sometimes a little bit a day or two, but we don't normally practice adaptations for a week or 2 or 3 weeks.
Yes.
Yeah, that's huge. Michael, I know you're new to the conversation, or you just joined the conversation. But just kind of curious if you have any other thoughts about today's topic, things that you've seen in your years of work with some of your past employers.
So I'm going to go with adaptation and resilience. So when the word resilience gets bandied around in both mass media and within the cyber community and the IT community, the follow-on pieces of that almost never really get talked about. Resilient to what? Resilient for how long? And resilient to what degree? If we don't ask those kinds of questions of ourselves, then we're missing an opportunity to increase our confidence that we can deal with the unexpected. Resilience, let me rephrase. Our teammates, our fellow employees, our fellow leaders, every company, unless they cease to exist, they're going to adapt. The question is whether that adaptation is maladaptive or if it is an adaptation that the company has anticipated, ideally rehearsed, and has some level of confidence in. And that feeds back into that design scenarios for which you don't normally do day-to-day reactions and then practice them. Your insurance companies will appreciate it, and your senior leadership will appreciate it because they've got a better idea of what kinds of scenarios they've practiced. And although no real life scenario ever matches what you practiced, it is a starting point from which you can all remember what you decided in that previous exercise, or what you knew you had tried in an exercise and we knew that wasn't going to work. So you didn't even go down that path. Mm-hmm. So avoid maladaptation by doing deliberate rehearsals.
Great feedback. Demetrius, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was. And, one of the things I think, years ago when we start talking, we touched on having a competent DR strategy, but, one thing that we started seeing in vernacular change was the move from DR to business continuity, right? Because years ago, it was acceptable to say, hey, it was anticipated that your primary location may go down. The second, it was meant to be interim, hopefully short term. And to Michael's point, how long can you withstand that if you're operating in a degraded state? So now, in 2023, it's more so, hey, if we need to run it from an alternative location, and that's becoming less and less of an issue with the introduction of cloud services. If I need to run, how long can I withstand that? And so do my users even know? My customers, are they impacted? Hopefully the answer to that question is no, because unlike 10 years ago, you can't afford to run in the greatest state for extreme periods of time.
Mm-hmm. Well, at this point, we're still looking for questions. We'd love to hear about your pain points that you've seen in your sectors of business. Your experiences with cyber insurance companies. If you've got something to say, please raise your hand, unmute, put a chat in the window. We'd love to hear about it. With that, I'd like to see if Michael or Demetrius have any last words. I'm kind of curious about where this is all heading, right? Because with the pipeline outage last year, these breaches just don't affect your organization anymore. These breaches could definitely affect civilization, right? So I think we all need to do our part, but I'm kind of curious about where it's all going and how this is going to, play out in the future with cyber insurance. I guess for the ones that are doing their homework and covering their bases, they're going to get reasonable rates because you're less risk. But for these bigger ones, there's a whole lot of risk involved in some of these bigger applications, like pipeline, energy, water treatment plants, all kinds of things like that. I just don't know where it's all going to go. Thoughts, any guys? Anyway,
So
I think we hadn't talked about this, but it's just, I'm just thinking out loud. This is just getting worse, right?
So Demetrius' thoughts are that, some of the things that we touched on here today are going to become, table stakes, just to do business, not optional anymore. And that's it, and that's not just an insurance play, that's just a cyber posture play, just to protect the citizens, protect the data. And so that's at least my initial thinking, especially seeing the trends from the government and some of the bans from coming down, the ban recommendations from the U.S. government about not paying these types of, not paying the ransomware and things like that. So
Okay.
that's where I'm thinking.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. Michael, anything? Last words? Otherwise, I'll move on. We got a couple more things to talk about.
I think I'll allow us to move on.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. So wrapping up, I just want to make sure that everyone's aware. I'd say it was probably about a month or two ago when the NASCIO top 10 priorities came out. National Association of State CIOs, produced a list of their top 10 priorities for the year of 2023. Obviously, cybersecurity is number one, right? Why wouldn't it be? So what we've done is on these top 10 priorities, I want to make sure this is a great resource for everybody out there. So I want to make sure you're aware of this. We've put together this website, and then the way you navigate the website, and the link is down here, is you click on the bottom. Obviously, this is 1 through 10 on the bottom. Number 1 being cybersecurity. When you click on that, and then click on more information over here, you'll get a list of all the office hours, live webinars we've done, as well as the blogs that we've written in the past based on that topic. So if you want to know more about, see some of the past work that the YouAlreadyOwnIt program has done on cybersecurity, click on this little icon, then go to more information, and it's really well indexed. So all of our past archives, recordings, as well as other things that Planet can do to help you out, are all there for you to look at. So I just want to make sure you're all aware that it's very well indexed. And if you've been looking for, past episodes of YouAlreadyOwnIt or blogs on any of these topics, this is a great and easy way to find that content. So definitely take a look at that there moving forward. Couple other final things, helpful links. If you have not seen the licensing matrix, I probably just made your day. You can slice and dice this website. It's something that has been produced by someone who's not a Microsoft employee, from what I understand, but he's put this together and he's committed to keeping this up to date. In fact, he just did an update in January, and I got to relearn some new stuff there that are new available. Licensing capabilities, but you can see exactly what's inside each one of these types of licenses, right? So if you have M365 E3, you click on that, you can see a list of every single capability that's in that license structure. Same thing with, E5, and then the security add-ons for E5. So if you're confused about what you own, what you don't own, first of all, always you have us as a resource. As a cloud strategist, we're happy to talk to you about licensing and try to figure out, how to make best use of your licensing by having a cloud strategy session. But if you want to take a look at that, check this out. Casey's going to send this out, and as far as the post information that we send out. So definitely take a look at this licensing matrix. If you've never seen it, you're going to love it. And then we included some links here for ransomware and some other protection items, the roadmap, and then obviously a link to that NASCIO top 10 priorities link there. Again, as always, the YouAlreadyOwnIt program has lots of benefits. Make sure you're taking advantage of them. Reach out to Michelle McGraw or the YouAlreadyOwnIt email address or your account team. We have lots of workshops for you to check out. These are free of charge. We want to work with you. If you're having thoughts about implementing Teams Voice, it's a great starter conversation. What about Viva? Same thing. Accelerating M365 adoption, how to get, talk about Azure costs and rationalization. These are great starter conversations. If you've never seen a secure score and don't know how to get started, great workshop on that. Definitely take advantage of these benefits. They're all free for you to use. Coming up next month, we've got a great topic. It's something that hasn't been talked about very much, but cloud governance, right? My fellow senior cloud strategist, Scott Dowling, will be here, and we're going to be talking about this discussion, specifically about Microsoft's 5 disciplines of cloud governance, which talk about, cost management, security baseline, identity baseline, resource consistencies, and deployment acceleration. So definitely check us out. Save the date, February 23rd at 1 o'clock. We hope to see you there. finally, thanks for joining us. And looks like we have no more other questions. I'm fine to stick around for a few more minutes if Demetrias and Michael can stick around too. Maybe somebody's got a question. We'll stick around till 2 o'clock. So please reach out to us if you have any questions. Thanks again. That's a wrap. We'll see you next month, and we'll hang out until 2. Thank you.